Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar today, being brought to you by Task. Task, as you know, is an institution created by the government of Telangana in order to help the students become more employable. Having said that, I think the way that we have been affected by the pandemic has been really changing things. And one of the things that we have seen change quite a lot today is how things are being done. We are talking about a digital economy. We are talking about a contact-free or contact-less economy. And that's where Task decided to bring you this webinar. At the outset, I'd like to welcome all the principals, the TPOs, and all the students, all the faculty members who are part of this webinar today. We have had webinars in the past on blended learning, etc. And we thought, why don't we look at a different kind of a thing and get one of the persons who has actually been associated with online learning, etc., for practically 2 decades to interact with all of you and also share his experience and his knowledge with us. So I'm extremely pleased to introduce you to Professor Jeremy B. Williams, who is also a great friend and an ex-colleague for me. To introduce Professor Williams, I would like to say Professor Williams is an education futurist and is frequently called upon to present keynote speeches at international conferences and webinars on the subject. He is noticed for his expertise in digital pedagogies, authentic assessment design, and his advocacy of open education resources. He has been published widely in this area, his main research focus being authentic learning environments and the way in which learning experiments might be better contextualized to promote greater student engagement and deeper learning. A PhD economist with more than 30 years of experience in higher education, Professor Williams is currently working with Sheikh Zayed University, Dubai. He has broad international exposure, having lived and worked in UK, Australia, Singapore, France, India, and of course now in Dubai and UAE. He has held several senior executive level positions in both university and corporate sector and has published 3 textbooks, more than 40 peer-reviewed papers, and over 50 other articles and papers. Specializing in economics of sustainability, apart from future and virtual education, Jeremy has taught a wide range of courses, graduate and undergraduate level, which he has delivered on campus and online in numerous universities and business schools around the world, including, amongst other, Queensland University of Technology, Griffith University in Australia, Neoma Business School in France, Otto von Zurich University in Germany, and Modal University in Dubai. He was also the academic head for corporate education at U21 Global and was instrumental in training many students in Telangana who were part of organizations like Virtusa, Wipro, and Satyam. He has worked with a number of companies around the world to improve their understanding and sustainability issues through executive education. So, Professor Jeremy Williams, welcome to this webinar on behalf of Task and all the faculty members and other participants who are here, which I'm told is currently at 350. To start with, we have 350 participants now attending this webinar. So a very warm welcome to you for this webinar. Before we actually start with the topic for today, would like to understand from you, Professor Williams, as to how has COVID impacted Dubai and UAE, and especially the educational institutions over there?
Okay, thank you, Shrikant, for your warm welcome and the comprehensive introduction. I barely recognize myself there. You waxed lyrical, my friend. But please, you must practice your German pronunciation before reading out the list of institutions I've been linked with next time. In answer to your question, Dubai, UAE, of course, it's been as affected as every other country around the world. I think it's fair to say that the government here have done reasonably good job of managing things. Of course, it is much easier to manage when you've got a population of 9 million instead of, what are you guys up to now, 1.3 billion?
That's right.
It's slightly more challenging, isn't it? But in terms of the impact on education, I have to say to you, and you'll know the backstory to this, but when coronavirus hit and all of a sudden everybody was in sort of panic mode, what do we do now? It was a question of, okay, we're dealing with this situation, and oh, and by the way, as from next week, you're all teaching online. And for many of my colleagues, it was like this kind of reaction, and I was smiling inwardly to myself, as I know you probably would be as well, given your long connection with education and online education. For so long now, there's been a group of us, a growing number of us, promoting the idea of online education and talking about the benefits and the affordances of going digital. And then all of a sudden, everybody wants to talk to us and find out, what do we do now, sort of thing. And one of the themes of this whole presentation I'm going to give this afternoon is what we've learned whilst we've been in panic mode, actually, being thrown in the deep end, and how we've dealt with it. And of course, as all educators know, you only learn by your mistakes. And trust me, there have been an awful lot of mistakes as everybody has gone online. So it'll be the same in this country as it is in just about every other country around the world.
Great. Yeah. So here also a similar kind of a thing happened, and a lot of people have gone online. And what we would like you to share with them is how can they make their learning sessions, the facilitation that they do online, more effective and learner-centric. So over to you, Jeremy.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me share my screen. And here we are. I'm not going to lose visibility of you now, Shrikant. So if you and Shruti, anybody else needs to message me if there's some tech problem. And of course there will be. You can't go through a webinar without there being a tech problem. So if you could just WhatsApp me. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
And my audio is fine. Okay, good. Well, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are, tucked away in your offices with masks on, or maybe sitting at home more comfortably. And here's my opening slide. And I hope you grasp the metaphor that I'm trying to use here. And it harks back to that comment I just made to Shrikant, that it literally was a case of a week's notice or a couple of weeks' notice, because the pandemic hit so hard and so quickly. Even the best prepared of institutions around the world would have been facing a pretty steep learning curve. And there's this expression in the English language, isn't there, about throwing people in the deep end. Well, the metaphor I've got here is bungee jumping. It's difficult to do anything new, anything that's very diametrically opposed to everything you've ever believed in, and something maybe that you've built a career on, to persuade you to change your ways after a long career, perhaps 20 years, 30 years, and do things drastically differently. It presents a psychological barrier. And when you've no choice, then it is rather like taking the plunge and This is why I think it's akin to bungee jumping.
Professor, can I request you to increase the size of your presentation or show it as a PowerPoint show, because some portion of it is getting cut.
Okay, let me fix that. Okay, you tell me if this is better.
Sir, in the streaming link, sir, the presentation is big enough. It is clear.
Okay, good. So this is fine. We can carry on. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm very pleased that so many task people, colleagues, faculty have come along this afternoon. And this is going to be pretty much one-way traffic, which is counter to my whole philosophy about learning and education. I'd much prefer it to be interactive, but with 350 of us, it can be a little difficult to do that. Obviously, I'm hoping there'll be some questions that can be filtered through to me by Shruti and Shrikant. But if you are digitally literate and you are a Twitterer, if you are a fan of social media, then if you don't mind me taking this initiative, Shrikant, I've just suggested a hashtag here. If anybody wants to comment on any aspect of the presentation this afternoon, then do so using Twitter. And if you could add the hashtag task0620, that would be helpful in terms of following the conversation. If you have any direct questions to me, then by all means, you can add my Twitter handle, which is @JeremyB.Williams. So I've got several sections in this presentation. I think I actually go to 7 sections. And the first is pedagogy pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. And this is an image which may be familiar to a few of the people in the audience this afternoon. If you've spent any time working in colleges or institutions of higher education, any institution for that matter, sometimes the job that we're doing doesn't exactly engage the learner. And Shrikant was mentioning I've been in online education now for a good couple of decades. It's actually longer than that. I actually started mucking around with computers in 1984 as a school teacher in England. And so I've always been interested in technology, but I only began to exploit the benefits of technology in terms of how it can be utilized to engage learners towards the end of the 1990s. And it was a direct result of one student falling asleep in my macroeconomics lecture one afternoon at QUT in Australia. I was deeply offended, of course, because I worked hard at my teaching. I typed my overhead transparencies as we used them in those days. I put my notes in the library for students. I mean, you know, I was, in my view, doing an extraordinarily good job. The reality, of course, is that it doesn't matter what kind of service you provide to the student, it doesn't matter how committed you are as a teacher, it's the delivery and how you engage the learner that is the most important thing. Just to cut a long story short there, I actually finished my lecture that afternoon, my macroeconomics class, and everybody left the room and the student was still asleep. Then I began to worry that maybe there'd be something dreadful happened to him, and the headlines in the newspaper next day would be Professor bores student to death. And I thought, you know, this could be the end of my career. I went over to this gentleman and shook him on the shoulder and said, excuse me, the lecture's finished. And he looked around and looked at me kind of weirdly. And it turned out that he'd actually fallen asleep in the econometrics class before mine. And this was a bit of a turning point for me, a bit of a epiphany, in that it made me think very, very deeply about how we educate people and the kind of job we do as educators. and caused me to think, if I want to do this job for the next 10, 20, 30 years, then I want to do the job and enjoy it. And I can't enjoy it if the students aren't enjoying it. So it was almost, I can almost pinpoint the moment when I decided to do things differently. This is pre-pandemic. This is post-pandemic. Why have I put an image up like this? Well, of course, what's happened is that everybody is doing exactly the same thing. The only change is that we've been lecturing through the computer rather than lecturing directly to students in the classrooms. Here's the problem. It's been scientifically proven that the average attention span of a human in the year 2012 seconds, by 2013 it had gone down to 8.25 seconds, which, to put that in context, is actually less than the average attention span of a goldfish. So even if things had stayed the same that afternoon in 1996 or whenever it was, when I decided that I needed to do something differently in my classrooms, the job has got progressively harder, and it's got progressively harder because the clientele, the demographic that are in our classrooms now, they think differently, they behave differently. People even say their brains are now wired differently because of the barrage of multimedia that these people interact with every day of their lives. They are used to flicking between TV channels, flicking between websites, flicking between various social media applications, not really spending a great deal of time doing any one thing. Now, you could argue that that's a bad thing, and maybe it is, but maybe it's also a message to us as educators that we need to think differently about learning design. You know, can we package our learning, our courses in such a way that it caters to the fact that the average attention span of learners is decreasing with each passing year? So coming back to pre-pandemic, this was a very familiar sight for me a few years ago. This is actually an old picture. It is not an advertisement for Apple computers, by the way. I have no stocks in Apple. It's obviously, or maybe it isn't, but I can tell you it is an American university. Maybe that's why there's so many Apple computers, because people can afford to buy Apple computers in the US, or at least they did then. This is around about 2017. Now, if I was in a situation where I had a small group of people interacting with me now, then I'd probably take the opportunity to ask a few questions and ask you how you think that situation that you see on screen now has changed to the present day. The difference is that I've noticed in the last maybe 3 years that students don't bring laptops to class anymore. The device of choice these days is a handheld device, and it's too cumbersome for them to bring a laptop along to class. I'll come back to that point because I think that's important. But the key point I want to make in relation to this slide is one could assume by looking at this image that technology is having a transformative effect in education. However, one other point of view that goes against that is what you see there is a lecture. There's a lecture with a lecturer in a lecture hall lecturing. All that's happening is that those students will be following the lecture slides maybe on their laptops, or maybe they're looking at websites that the lecturer is referring to in his or her slides. But equally, if you're a bit more skeptical, the students may be fixing up their makeup, they may be editing a Wikipedia page, they may be stalking their professor on Facebook, they may be watching a different lecture, actually, if the one that they're sitting in isn't that interesting, and so forth. I mean, this is a satirical analysis here. The Stanford Flip Side is a satirical newspaper published by students at Stanford University, or at least it was a few years ago. But the point is that just because someone has brought their device along to a class, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it for that class if the mode of delivery is one that's essentially didactic. It's somebody at the front talking, no interaction with the class, and therefore it's very easy for their minds to wander and look at alternative forms of entertainment, given especially this rapidly declining attention span. Post-pandemic, this is a characterization of how things are now if we lived in an ideal world. Is it any different?
Jeremy, just a minute. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Are you still on slide 2? Because on the presentation, your slide is on 2. The second slide. Have you moved ahead?
No, I've moved much further ahead.
Yes.
Much
On the presentation, it's still stuck on 2.
Mm-hmm.
So probably could just
okay. We might need to rethink this.
Yeah, and if you could also convert it into a full screen mode, so the slide will appear bigger.
It is in full screen. It is full screen. So I can't use presentation mode, can I? So what I'm going to have to do is just use slide mode.
Yes. Now we can see a different slide. I think it's slide 10.
Yeah, well, everybody will have missed my jokes now from those few slides that you've had.
Yeah, so now it's a different slide. Yeah. Also, could you click on the public chat and collapse it sideways?
I can't see the public chat because I've...
All right, fine. Okay, you can continue. Now the slide is okay.
All right. I'm just going to make this as big as I can. It's a shame because I lose the animations in this now. Never mind. Okay, so that's the last slide you saw, was it? The second slide. Correct? Right, okay. So first section, pedagogy, pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. This is my slide where I was talking a minute ago, giving you my story of a student falling asleep in my macro class in Australia. This is my slide. I was talking about how really not much has changed. Going from face-to-face to online, if we're still using the same pedagogy, this didactic lecturing pedagogy. Here's the slide talking about the average attention spans, 8.25 seconds compared to 9 seconds, the average attention span of a goldfish. And here's the slide where I was talking about, this is probably a dated slide now, where 2017, not that long ago, and everybody's taking laptops to class. These days, people now bring in smaller digital handheld devices. So I asked the question, is this evidence on screen of technology being a transformative phenomenon in terms of how we deliver education? I would suggest not, because they're using those devices maybe for looking at the professor's slides as we go through them, but maybe also, and here's the satirical magazine from Stanford University, published by the students, maybe fixing up their makeup, maybe stalking the professor on Facebook, maybe even watching a different lecture. It's poking a bit of fun, really, but the takeaway from this is just because there is technology in a classroom, it does not mean that that technology is being harnessed, effectively harnessed, to improve educational outcomes. And that's going to be one of the themes I'm going to be pursuing this afternoon. So post-pandemic, are things any different? I would argue not. I think that what has happened, instead of giving lectures to the students face-to-face in a lecture theatre, we're just doing it through a webinar, rather like, ironically, we're doing today. But I think if we're talking about large numbers in the audience, sometimes you've no choice but to do things like this, where the opportunities for interaction will be more limited. So is the progress of education using technology, is it really just a case of old wine in new bottles? You know, a lecture is a lecture is a lecture. It's just that we're now doing it in the comfort of our own homes. Note well that I've put the word comfort in a set of inverted commas here, because there are all kinds of horror stories about how things have changed now that we can't go to class and sit peacefully in a lecture room listening to our professor, and we have to do that at home now via our laptop. That doesn't mean to say things are necessarily more comfortable. I can speak to this from a very personal point of view, in that when you have a small child around the place, it can be difficult to balance things. So there's a good chance that a small child might burst into this webinar as well at some stage, but I've managed to bribe her with chocolate biscuits at the moment. The classic case, I don't know whether you saw this, but there was a beautiful live interview on BBC with a professor who specialised in Korean politics, I think it was. And there he was on live BBC News. You can go and watch it. I'll put the YouTube URL there if you haven't seen it. But this guy became very famous. He and his wife and his two children became very famous when one of his daughters decided to come and sit with him while he was being interviewed by the BBC. So it comes with its own challenges, teaching at home. And this meme made me smile when it came across social media a few weeks ago. And it harks back to the point I was making earlier about how quickly coronavirus took hold, and everything was okay one week, and then the next week it was okay, everybody listen up, as from next week we have to teach online. And of course, for the vast majority of people, they'd never taught online before, and it was literally, what do I do? Where do I start? You know, it was all very, very difficult. So things haven't worked out quite as well as people would have liked, but as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. If you are a seasoned campaigner as an educator, you will know very well that the best way of learning is to make mistakes, because if you make a mistake, it sticks in the mind, and you will do everything within your powers to make sure that same mistake doesn't happen again. So at this juncture, having sort of set the context, I'm asking the question here, is there a silver lining to the dark COVID-19 cloud? And I suggest, and I put it to you, all of you listening in, watching the presentation this afternoon, that now is the time to seize the moment. This is the Latin phrase on screen, carpe diem, seize the moment, seize the day. And I think it's quite common for many of us, particularly those of us who are a little bit older, who are a little bit more experienced, to push back. We'll say comments like this: we've always done it this way, why should we change? That arguably is one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language, in my opinion, because change is the law of life. And as John F. Kennedy once said that those of us who refuse to change are certain to get left behind. And this has always been one of my guiding principles in life, that we must never stop learning. Again, if you're an educator of worth, you will subscribe to this view. It's a lifelong journey, isn't it? Lifelong learning is one of our maxims as educators. And so it's important that we always try and move with the times and understand how the demographic that we interact with, how the learner is changing. You know, what's going on in their lives? How are their lifestyles changing? How do their lifestyles compare to our own when we were that age, and indeed to our current lifestyle? These are important questions. One of my, if I can give you a big hint, despite my advancing years, I'm 60 years old now, and despite my advancing years, I always try and make a point of signing up for everything. So every time I see a new app or a new website or a new web service, let's say, I'll always subscribe to the beta version, or at least for a little while, so I can find out what's going on. And sometimes that's all I do, and I don't do anything else. But on other occasions, I'm going to share a few of these recent applications that I've been using lately. There'll be other occasions where it's been an absolute boon, that it's helped me transform the way that I deliver my courses. So this is a problem, and if you are involved with professional development of colleagues, this is probably the biggest hurdle that you have to overcome. Entrenched views, and what you have to do, in my experience, is this: you have to be respectful. You have to be respectful of the fact that if you're, maybe in your 50s, late 40s, into your 50s, and you have been a respected teacher for, a decade or more, and someone comes along and says, excuse me, we can't do it that way anymore. We're going to do it this way instead. It's a huge blow to your self-esteem. It's a huge psychological hurdle that someone will have to overcome. If they've written books, they've won prizes for the way that they've taught classes, and then someone comes along and says, sorry, we've got to do things differently. You have to be respectful of the fact that that's going to be enormously difficult for someone to accept. We have to unlearn teaching, is the answer. And I'll be arguing in a moment that we really have to teach a lot less. We have to teach a lot less and let students learn, because sometimes we can get in the way of their learning. And as Alvin Toffler famously said, the illiterates of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And once you become comfortable with that kind of messy approach, I mean, it's unstructured, it's disorderly, and accept the fact that it's unlikely, if you become an expert in a particular area, that you will retain that expertise throughout your career. You might be an expert for a short period of time, but if some disruptive innovation comes along, then all of a sudden you're on the periphery. All of a sudden you may even become redundant, because the kinds of things that you're an expert in are no longer in demand. So this is quite a direct quote. It's sort of in your face. A lot of people may recoil from this particular statement from Jill Berkowitz and Ann Myers in an article they published in 2015. Quote, "It is no longer acceptable for any educator to say, I'm not good with the computers." And their argument is that if you do that, then you are potentially disadvantaging your students, the children, the young adults that you are teaching. The fact is, whatever you think about it, technology is now given. It's not going to go away. It's here to stay. If anything, it's going to become more sophisticated. So I look at this whole question the same way as I look at climate change. The debate is over. Okay, the science is in. It's not going to go back to the way it was. So the only alternative we have is to move forward with it and live with it and accommodate it in a way that suits us. In the case of India, and as Shrikant mentioned, I'm a good friend of India. I've been coming to India now for well over 25 years. I lived in Mumbai for a couple of years myself. I've interacted with a lot of Indian students. I've been an adjunct faculty at a couple of universities, a visiting faculty at a couple of universities in India. And one of the things that I've seen nowhere else in any other country I've worked in, without exception, is the comfort level, the high comfort level that young Indian students have with technology. Okay, and the kind of technology that they're using, I mean, this is where I first woke up to the fact, you know, I was saying to students, when you come to class, make sure you bring your laptop because we're going to be using laptops in class. And they come to class, no laptop to be seen at all. I say, haven't you got any laptops? Oh, yes, but they're at home, Professor. I said, well, why didn't you bring them? Oh, we prefer to use these. And they put these handheld devices up to show. And they say, oh, yeah, I can do everything on this device here. And that therein lies an example of how, if you're a little bit older, you don't have to be my age, but if you're maybe in your 40s or 50s, you might be thinking in a certain way, and something's changed in a younger generation, and their device of choice is one that's different to the one that you choose. All right. So what I observed, and I was in India from 2015 to 2017, and this is when I started to see this happening. You started to see some fairly low cost handheld devices coming into the marketplace. And for me at that time, it was just a choice between a phone or a laptop. I did own an iPad, but I didn't use it that much. I didn't feel comfortable with it. And then came along, I don't know whether you can see it on screen now. I mean, I'm using one now. This is much larger than the handheld device I used to use. I used to have an iPhone 5, I think it was. It wasn't much bigger than a credit card, really. But then I realized that if you got a slightly larger screen, I think the phone I gravitated to after that was an iPhone 6S. It was the largest screen I ever had on a handheld phone. But the significant thing was the screen is large enough for you to do things. You can type more easily. You can watch videos. You can watch whole movies, in actual fact, and something you can slip in your pocket. And I began to understand what it was that students were saying when they sort of groaned at me when I asked them to bring their laptops. But one thing for sure, as time has passed, the internet connectivity has become something that people just really can't live without. I mean, this is it's a ruse. It's a satirical look at this. You know, it's said that we can go a month without food, a week without water, 4 or 5 days without sleep, but we can only go a couple of hours without connectivity to the internet, which is not true, of course. And here's another sort of poke at a poke of fun here. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We all need these basic human needs, these physiological needs like food and water and shelter. And some waggers modified this diagram and scribbled Wi-Fi underneath. And of course, this circulates around the internet. It becomes a meme, and everybody has a good laugh about it. And then people even add to it again. They think, well, actually, it's not. Wi-Fi is not the most basic of needs. The battery is, and connectivity to charge my battery. I'm joking, of course, but maybe I'm not joking that much. I mean, this is how much technology and connected devices have taken over our lives. So on the question of technology in education, it's a given. However, it's how we use the technology that's most important, because boring stuff is boring stuff is boring stuff. And it doesn't matter if you put boring stuff on an iPad or a tablet or a laptop or any kind of digital device. If it's boring, it's boring. Okay? So this leads me to the discussion about pedagogy. And I love this quote from ITS Learning: you can lead a class technology, but only pedagogy makes kids think. The play, of course, on the old English adage that you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. And the same principle applies here. I've been to so many colleges and schools around the world, most notably in India, and those schools I've been to where they're quite wealthy, I've seen no end of expensive technology in classrooms, but in many cases it's sitting there gathering dust. I've seen so many smart boards in so many institutions, it's not funny. And yet when I'm asking people how they're using the smart boards, they're using them as glorified whiteboards in many cases. So it's a question of, okay, access to the technology is one thing, but how are you using that technology? That's the most important question. Certainly, one of the hurdles we have to overcome is people's fear of technology. And one of the things I want to get across to you as best I can this afternoon is that you do not have to be a techie to be good at using technology in education. The most important requirement for all of us is to be pedagogues, right? We need to understand about how students learn, what makes them tick, what engages them and excites them, which then allows them to enter into deep learning as opposed to surface learning. If you go into education and you go into education because you're good at using technology, that is not the reason you should become an educator. You become an educator because, number one, you love working with young people. Number two, it's because imparting learning, helping people to become better human beings, better citizens, this is what motivates the vast majority of us. Indeed, you could argue that that's the only thing that motivates us, because we don't get paid enough. We don't do it for the money, that's for sure. So what does it take to become a 21st century educator? This is what I'm going to be going into in the next section of this presentation. And as I hinted just now, it's about the pedagogy, not the technology. I think, again, if I could emphasize this point, if you are listening in, watching this presentation this afternoon, and you're an individual who's responsible for the professional development of your colleagues, this is the key point. You somehow have to emphasize this point so that they then internalize the fact, okay, so I'm a good teacher, therefore I can do this, right? It's not about how geeky you are, how techy you are, it's how good a teacher you are. So it's inevitable that initially there may be some resistance to change. This is normal. This is normal. Some people love change, they thrive on change, but we're talking here about a very small minority. There'll be a group of people in the middle of your distribution, if you will, your normal distribution of educators. There'll be a group in the middle that, some will be faster to adopt than others. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have people who simply refuse to change. Typically, from my experience, those that do refuse to change tend to go and do something else or retire early or something. But none of us can stand in the way of change. Once it gains a certain critical mass and a certain momentum. the phrase, the quote I always use when I do professional development around the place, different countries around the world, is, you know, people saying, "Oh, well, it's all very well you saying that, you know, it's difficult for me. I'm not sure to work with my subject," and so on. And I say, "Do you have a Facebook account?" Yes, I do. Yeah, are you on LinkedIn? Yep, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Did you ever go and have a training session to use Facebook or LinkedIn? And they, of course, they shake their head and say, "No, I just tried it." I said, "Well, guess what? That's what we do when we learn how to use these new technologies for the purposes of education." So here's another great quote, which I use frequently, actually, to make this point about it being the pedagogy, not the technology. It's rather like saying that music is not the piano. Learning is not in the device. Music is not in the piano. You have to have somebody with their hands on the keyboard making that music, creating that music. And I think it's important as professional educators that we look for these kinds of metaphors to help people understand what is required, okay, and help them overcome any psychological barriers that may cause them to cling on to dear life for the old way of doing things. And this guy here, I don't know whether you've heard of him, a chap called Bill Gates, former chairman of Microsoft now, of course. He said one time, you can go and Google and find the right source for this. I don't think I've got it on my slide here, but technology is just a tool in terms of getting the kids working together and motivating. The teacher is the most important. So I think of anybody, this guy who's made his fortune out of technology, for him to say this, I think I don't need to mount any further arguments about the importance of pedagogy over technology. Certainly, if we ask ourselves, have learners been more engaged by the use of technology so far? I can remember when I switched from overhead transparencies which you use on overhead projectors. I'm conscious of the fact there may be people in the audience who don't even know what an overhead projector is. I'm showing my age. But I switched from overhead transparencies to PowerPoint probably in around 1997. I'm guessing 97, 98. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, this is it. I've arrived as an educator because this is just going to revolutionize the way I teach and the way I engage with students. And it did, but for a short period of time, because before long, and maybe it was the early 2000s, we started hearing, "Oh, here we go again, death by PowerPoint," and similar type of phrases. Because at the end of the day, what do we use PowerPoint for? Well, we use it for delivery in a way that, you know, it's useful for the students in that they can download the slides after the lecture or even get them before the lecture, and they can sit there and go through them. So it saves them having to scribble and write down notes. But in a way that's worse, because if they're sitting there and not doing anything, then that's when their eyelids start to droop and they start to disengage. So PowerPoint, is it good? Is it bad? We're using it today, given the circumstances that we have to have this seminar. But we have to use it in a guarded, careful manner, rather than just have a slide deck of 150 slides and have students sit there and wait for us to wade through them. Certainly, it does not create any authentic learning environments. Okay, now ultimately, this is what we have to think about as educators. Why are we there? What are we providing? How are we helping these learners, these students? And the big answer, the sort of looking at it from the bird's eye view, the big answer is here, we are preparing them for life. Okay, we're preparing them for life to make the right kinds of decisions as citizens, as voters, as members of families, and also preparing them for work as professionals, and workers in every sector of the economy. And preparing people for life, you have to enable them to think critically. And I would argue that sitting through, 60 slide PowerPoint is not necessarily allowing them to think too critically. We also need to give them problems to solve. All right, rather than here are the problems and here are the solutions, we need to think about the order with which we deliver education. And this guy, Alan Blinder, who's an economist, amazingly, I haven't got a great deal of time for economists. I'm an economist myself, but I'm a recovering economist. He famously said that life is an open book exam. And I love that phrase because the kinds of assessments we set in universities and colleges and schools around the place don't really model anything that happens in the real world. So the way I look at it is the way we've done it for decades now is we sit around the start of the year and we say, right, so who's teaching Economics 101 this year? Okay, well, I'll do Economics 101. Okay, so what topics are you going to cover? So the first thing we talk about is content. So, all right, so you're going to do this topic, that topic, the other topic, and how are you going to assess them? Well, maybe I'll give them an essay to do, perhaps a multiple choice quiz halfway through, mid-semester test, and then I'll finish with a closed book examination, okay? And then, and only then, do we think about how that content and those assessment items might link to the prescribed learning outcomes of the course. Now, I think we've got it the wrong way around, actually. I think we just need to think, what do we need to be able to get these students to do? What do they need to demonstrate what they can do once they get to a position where they can apply for work? How can they prove to prospective employers that they can think critically and they do have disciplinary knowledge to go with generic skills and attributes? And is the process that we put them through in schools and colleges and universities, is it really preparing them for life? And, I often put it to, and I've been teaching MBA students for many years now, and if you are an MBA graduate, you do not go into the office in the morning and have your boss come up to you and say, you're an MBA, aren't you? And you say, yes, I'm an MBA. Okay, we've got this problem and we need to solve this problem pretty quickly. And can you go in that room over there, close the door, don't talk to anybody, don't turn your computer on, don't open any books, and answer these 40 multiple choice questions so we can solve this problem. How authentic is that? We prepare students to pass tests. We prepare students to pass exams. We don't necessarily teach them disciplinary expertise, right? They might cram in their head the night before an exam, right? What do the Indians say? Mug up, right? You mug up for an exam. You hope it stays in the head long enough for you to sort of data dump the next day. And how much knowledge do you retain the next day, or how much would you know a year after, let's say? So my point is this, and this is another one of my favorite quotes. It's not mine. I plagiarized it from somebody else. Knowledge is not something a learner absorbs. It's something a learner creates. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the phrase learning by doing. And I've linked that to a comment I've made at least twice now. Let learners make mistakes. It's okay to make a mistake. You don't have to mug up and be a topper to be employable. You know, it's good for you to make mistakes and bungee jump, to use that metaphor, throw them in the deep end, let them figure out what's going on, and then the knowledge is retained, particularly if they get the opportunity to create something which demonstrates their learning. So to sum up on this section, I'm arguing that we need to completely turn the education process about. All right, we need to turn it on its head and first of all think about learning outcomes. So we're going to offer a course on economics. What do we want them to be able to do by the time they've finished this course in practical terms? Okay, and then you ask yourself the question, what kinds of assessments can we set them that will allow them in the process of doing that assessment to continue learning? Okay, that means that knowledge is going to stick. It's going to be learning that lasts. It stays in the mind. They don't forget it, and it becomes useful to them in later life. Then and only then do we start talking about, okay, what kind of content can we bring into this course that we can use almost like example material to allow them to undertake those assessments. So it's a complete about face in terms of the usual transmission mechanism that we have in educational institutions in India and elsewhere. And this leads me to, on the question of completely turning things around, this leads me to this, what's become a buzzword in education, probably for the last maybe 5 or 6 years now, this idea of the flipped classroom. This is one of the affordances, this is one of the deliverables of technology, okay? This is what technology allows us to do that we couldn't do before we had digital devices and the internet and digital delivery platforms. So what is flipped learning? What is the flipped classroom? Well, we're essentially talking about a form of blended learning, okay? It's not pure face-to-face, it's not pure online, and it's where students can access content via the web in a variety of forms. It can be short videos, it can be podcasts, it can be readings. They also have the opportunity to interact. This is very important. Many of the classes that are offered in universities and colleges around the place have limited opportunities for interaction. And it's interaction with peers and faculty, and it can be done synchronously, as in face-to-face in a physical setting. It can be done synchronously in an online setting. Increasingly now we have these types of tools that we're using today. Zoom, of course, seems to be the platform of choice these days. Skype, Adobe Connect, Google have just launched their own web conferencing tool, which is integrated with Chrome and Gmail. Microsoft have really gone into this in a big way. But you can also have that interaction asynchronously. And this is where I think we've dropped the ball as educators, because if we look at the current generation, the millennials, not millennials, it's a Generation Z now, but certainly it started with the millennials. Their preferred method of communication is using their digital device. And it can be very annoying for baby boomers like me if you're sitting having dinner or something and there's somebody there, you know, tapping away on their device, sending emails and WhatsApps and various other short messages. So we need to design courses which allows them to interact with one another in their preferred way of interaction. So, if it's using a platform that's similar to Twitter or similar to WhatsApp or Instagram, these are the tools we need to look at and say, okay, how can we use those tools, integrate them into our courseware in order to engage the learner. So the advantage of flipping the classroom, particularly if we've got some materials, we've accumulated some resources, it frees up time to that we would have previously allocated to these kind of didactic lecture sessions to introduce more learner-centric face-to-face sessions. So instead of attending lectures delivered by lecturers in lecture theatres, we can be more adventurous and we can set problem-solving workshops that we as faculty facilitate rather than teach at. All right? We don't go in there and say, well, I know all the answers, listen to me and write down what I say and everything's going to be fine. Find real problems, or if they're not real problems that actually exist, find ones that have the semblance of being real, that they're authentic, sufficiently authentic for the learner to believe this is worth doing. Okay, students from the millennials to the present generation Z, if I can use this, and I don't like using bad language at the best of times, but please, I apologize if people are offended, but millennials and Generation Z have a very low bullshit threshold. Okay, and they're not impressed by glossy brochures promoting a university or a college. Okay, they're not impressed with your ability to manipulate media. They don't look to you to show them leadership. It may have been the case long ago for baby boomers like myself and maybe Generation X, but they're very happy to find things out for themselves, right? And if they want to choose between going to your college or somebody else's college, they won't read your brochure. They might have a quick look at your website, but what they're really interested in is what their peers are saying. Is this a good place to go? Is it worth the money for me paying? Am I going to actually learn anything? Will the qualification be recognised? And they'll get it from people online rather than what you tell them on your website or in the brochures. But just imagine if attending a class in person on campus happened because students wanted to be there rather than because they had to be there. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is where it's at, right? I mean, I am extremely happy in my job as a professor. I consider myself extraordinarily privileged to do what I do. I never go to bed at night thinking, oh, I got work tomorrow. Never, because I love what I do. If, however, I had not had that student fall asleep in my class in 1996, that caused me to reflect deeply on what it is that I was doing, then maybe I wouldn't be sitting here now. Maybe I'd be doing something else. But this is what I get a buzz from. If you can see that you have ignited the interest of the students, and you can see a student change, the person that walks into the class in the first week is very different to the person that leaves your classroom on last week, then for me, that's what it's all about. And to be happy in your professional life, not necessarily one that's very highly paid, I acknowledge, but to be happy in your professional life, I think is very important. This guy, big hero of mine, Ken Robinson, if you've not heard of him, go and Google him and watch his TED Talks. He's a British guy that works in the United States, has worked in the US now for a long time. Lovely man, and his presentations are something to marvel at. He came out with this quote in a recent, not so recent now, but a TED talk that he gave. Human intelligence is richer and more dynamic than we've been led to believe by formal academic education. And he is one, and his book, title of his book there, Out of Our Minds, Learning to be Creative. He thinks that we, our species, humankind, we are biologically, genetically, we are curious, all right? And I think if we weren't curious, then we wouldn't be where we are today, sitting on top of the food chain, right? He argues, and I agree with him, that we're all naturally curious. And then we go to school. And then we go to school, and people say to us, shut up, sit down, be quiet, don't talk. And all of a sudden, that sort of natural curiosity and need to interact so drummed out of us, and we end up taking on this kind of robotic way and then navigate our way through the system. And that's what it is. It's a system that, for the benefit of government, I think, more than anything else, is churning people out at the other end. It's like a sausage factory where you say, okay, here's my bit of paper that says I have a bachelor's in XYZ. Or here's my master's degree in obscure facts, when really, and what's in demand in the workplace, what's in demand in the corporate world and the government world and all sectors, the third sector, NGOs, etc., we want people who can think. We want people who can solve the complex problems that face us these days. And believe you me, we will get increasingly complex problems. COVID-19 has really served up the problem of all problems. And here's the bad news, is that COVID-19 is really a bit like having a pinprick compared to the scale of the problems we might experience in the not too distant future unless we get our act together in confronting climate change. We are living on a finite planet, and we're behaving in a way that assumes there to be an infinite amount of resources. Okay, this is the next big challenge that lies ahead. I think we'll probably have a lot more viruses to contend with, and we need to make sure we're ready for that and resilient for that. And we need to have a workforce. We need to have a population of smart people in all countries around the world to be able to address these issues. And the education sector is the entity with the primary responsibility for dealing with it. So to conclude on this section, it's not about technology, it's about pedagogy. It's not about teaching to the test, it's about providing authentic learning environments for young people to construct their learning, to create knowledge rather than just open up the head, pour in the facts and figures, shut the head and go and sit the test. And good teaching is showing learners how to learn and where to look, but not necessarily what to see. And in that sense, we can look upon learning as being a voyage of discovery, albeit it being guided discovery. And that's our role in the early part of the 21st century. That is our role, to make sure that we prepare young people for this increasingly difficult world that they're going to have to live in and inhabit, and their families are going to have to live in and deal with the issues that will be confronting us. So I'm going to finish now by spending a bit more time looking at the detail, and these are kind of practical things for you to consider, whether you're looking at it from your own individual point of view or whether you are doing it as a person responsible for professional development in your institution. If we agree that flipping education, flipping the classroom is the best way to go, and this is a good way of harnessing the power of technology, how do we go about it? Well, you have to do two things. As an individual educator in 2020, if you want to be effective, you have to be, number one, a creator, and number two, a curator. So in terms of creating learning resources, I mean, this is what we've always done, but we need to think about the different types of learning resources we can create. So one thing that I've been doing in the last 3 months, I guess, 2 or 3 months, now I've done it before in a piecemeal way, but now I do it routinely, is that for my students at Z University, I pre-record stuff. So I have my PowerPoint presentation. I do recordings of live PowerPoint presentations as well. I mix it up a little bit. But there's a fabulous new tool. If you've not come across it already, please go and take a look. It's called Loom, and it's free for educators. Has been free for educators since the lockdown. And it is a wonderful, wonderful, very easy to use recording app. So what happens is you get your PowerPoint on the screen, you click a button, there's some various settings, you can change the size of your picture. The one on screen right now is a little large. I typically have mine quite small and tucked away on the top right-hand side of my slide. And then away you go, you talk over your slides. You can annotate as you're going through onto the slide, and you record it. And as soon as you hit the stop button, bingo, there it is, sitting on the Loom site. So it's a bit like how we will have done in the past, but maybe some of you have done that on YouTube. Maybe you've used some other screencasting device like QuickTime or Camtasia or ScreenFlow. There's lots of tools out there that you can use. Some of them are quite expensive. Loom is free, and I really like the ease of interaction. And you can download the video that you've created on Loom and upload it to your learning management system, or upload it to YouTube and keep it there if you'd like. But you know, that's your choice. But this is a big hint for you, one tip if you like, something new. But that's one example of a learning resource that you personally can create. There's lots of others, of course. But the other thing that I'm a really strong advocate of is your role as an educator also being one of curator. Now, if you look up the word curator in the dictionary, it's a keeper or custodian of a museum or some other collection. And these days, there is an absolute wealth of open educational resources, high quality educational resources that are there available to you to use completely free. They're, for all intents and purposes, resources that people have created and then thought to themselves, well, I spent a long time creating this resource. It may be useful to somebody else. So I'll put it out there on the web for other people to use if they want to use it. And they might put on a Creative Commons license, which essentially says, take my work, use it as you will, add to my work, but if you do add to it, do two things: acknowledge me, acknowledge my copyright in terms of my creative copyright, not that you want to be paid for it. Acknowledge that I was the creator of the resource, and don't change it in such a way that is disparaging to me. Okay, so this Creative Commons movement, good 10 years old now, probably longer, very important. And each passing year, the quality of the resources, these open educational resources, grows and grows and grows. And if you do I mean, you can do courses on OER. There's lots of people offering MOOCs and so on now. But essentially, it's about, I mean, it takes various forms, but it can be video, it can be books or chapters or PowerPoints or podcasts, all kinds of materials that's out there in the public domain. And you as a curator, this is what I do routinely every time I offer a course. I'll spend half a day just simply gathering resources. I don't necessarily know how I will use those resources when I gather them, or I'll be tagging them. So I'll watch a video on my YouTube, and I'll save it to my YouTube channel, and I'll categorize it. So I'm collecting resources. There's no end of and I'm going to give you a few more examples in a minute. There's no end of ways in which you can tag and catalog stuff so you know where to find it later. So content creation, content curation, and then you need a place to put it to deliver it to students. If your college, your institution has a learning management system, fine, all well and good. If it doesn't, then there's free options for you. There's Google Classrooms, of course. One I particularly recommend and use a lot, if I do any job as a visiting professor, so for example, I've been going to Germany to teach a course at a university in Germany, and I've used my own personal learning management system on Canvas. Canvas is a really nice, clean interface, and I store all of my courses there. Okay, so every course I teach at every university that I've taught at, I keep a copy of that course and the resources that I've used on Canvas. So if anybody asks me, Jeremy, can you come and do a course intensively at our university at this particular time? I've got it all there ready and waiting, and I only have to make some modifications to actually go along and do a visiting professor gig. But it also guards against, if you change jobs and all of your materials are sitting on a learning management system at the old college, and it may be difficult for you to get that material and take it to your new college, then this is a useful site to have. Canvas, go and take a look. You can sign up as an individual. It's completely free. Other tools, I've already said I'm not advertising for Apple, and I will preface what I say here when I say I'm not advertising for Microsoft Teams. I will tell you that for many years, probably the best part of 20 years, I had nothing but criticism for Microsoft. I was very anti-Microsoft. I thought they were just big and cumbersome, monolithic, not terribly innovative. But they have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. And Office 365 is completely free on an educational license, completely free. There's certain criteria that they'll look at, but basically it doesn't matter whether you're public sector or private sector, the whole Microsoft suite is there, it's available for you to use. If you are working on very fine margins, you want to deliver courses of a 21st century quality, then you don't need to look too much further than Office 365. And the platform there that's, I think, getting better all the time is Microsoft Teams. What this enables us to do, whether you use Teams or Google Classrooms or Canvas or any other learning management system, if you've got a multi-tool platform that allows you to bring things in to the platform that are already out there, this is where we can start to be really innovative. Some learning management systems are very inward looking. They only allow you to do certain things, and it's very difficult for you to integrate new tools as they come along into that platform. But if you've got a good platform, and I'm giving you a couple of examples here, then what this does, it allows us to get away from what I consider to be the ritualistic use of textbooks. Right? Textbooks are very expensive. They become out of date very quickly. They may never be quite like what you want and your particular way of delivering content. And I've not used textbooks as at least to drive a course now for probably 10 years. I will have my own materials, and if the university I'm working at mandates that there has to be a textbook prescribed, then fine, if there's a reference. I won't tell students not to look at it, but it's much more engaging for the learner and for you as as the educator, if you can create and curate your own materials and put a wrapper around them and offer them on a system like Microsoft Teams or Canvas or Google Classrooms, and there's a great sense of ownership and pride in it because you know it's your work. So just to conclude this section, I think, again, I repeat because it's important, if you're responsible for professional development of colleagues, be very, very sensitive to the fears that they might have over new technologies. And the trick is to point out to them that really it's about the pedagogy, and if they're good teachers, then everything's going to be fine. And then once they overcome that hurdle and they see the affordances of the various technologies, they see the higher learner engagement, they see it's possible to make global connections with different colleges, different professors all over the world. You can have powerful conversations with these people. You can have the delivery of the course as complex as you want, so you accommodate individual learning needs. You've got online support because you're part of a learning community. Then very quickly, these people who may have been a little bit apprehensive, they soon realize that technology is there as an asset rather than a threat. So just quickly, I mean, some of these apps, I'm sure you've come across them. Pinterest is great for saving images to use in your PowerPoint presentations. LinkedIn these days, fantastic material is shared on LinkedIn. You can blog on LinkedIn as well as platforms like WordPress. Scoop It, SlideShare. The one I use, and I was considering using it today, I use all of the time now with my classes, both face-to-face and online, is Kahoot. So I actually teach now using Kahoot. So I'll be putting up a slide, asking some Kahoot questions. They get to use their handheld devices to give answers. The answers immediately appear on their responses, immediately appear on screen. Fabulous tool. And again, guess what? It's free. It's free. And during the lockdown, they've made the premium version of Kahoot available to all educators free of charge. So if you haven't used Kahoot, give it a go. If you have used Kahoot and aren't aware of the premium features, which are quite expensive, go and take a look because it's really good. And see how you might integrate that into your classes, both online and face-to-face, to enhance interactivity. I can go on all afternoon. Padlet is a worth look. YouTube, of course. I mean, everybody now should be expert in YouTube, particularly, I mean, as an educator, you should all have your own YouTube channel for uploading your own videos, but also for saving videos that you find when you're curating materials, putting them into categories. There may be categories according to courses that you teach. It's up to you, but certainly it's rather, I look at YouTube these days, it's rather like the filing cabinet I used to have in my office in the 1980s, except it's a digital filing cabinet. So to conclude the point on curation, I like this quote from Robert Scoble, who says that a curator is an information chemist. He or she mixes atoms together in a way to build an info molecule, then adds value to that molecule. So you're taking what's out there, you might be remixing it with stuff, you might be adding stuff to it. When you finish with it, it'll be a different artifact to the one that you curated, and then you put it out there again, share and share alike, pay it forward, become part of the OER revolution, the Open Educational Resources revolution, and all of our lives become a lot easier as a consequence. So I'm mindful of time here. I've been going for an hour and a half, so I'm going to start wrapping up. What happens once you've created and curated? Well, it's now about delivery, and this slide I did animate, and it helps explain it. But if I just cast your eye first of all to the top left hand corner here. Once you've curated and created, you've got all your learning resources, you've got a fully digitized curriculum, and then you'll have already had a set of learning outcomes. And then it's a question of how you're going to use those set of learning resources, your digitized curriculum, how you're going to use them to achieve these learning outcomes. So, as I mentioned earlier on, these learning outcomes are essentially, these are the things we want them to be able to do. All right. So then we start thinking about the kinds of deliverables. So we'll have some multiple pedagogies that will be essentially assessment driven. So these are the problems that we need to be solved, and there's various ways in which we can solve them. We can use sessions like this to get information. We can use blogs and wikis. We can use streamed audio, streamed video, synchronous and asynchronous discussion, both online and face-to-face. And then we can even get some flexibility in terms of how we deliver our courses. Is it over a standard semester-long course, or is it intensive delivery? Is it face-to-face on campus, or is it purely online, or is it some combination of there? So it's a question of taking account of your student body, taking account of their lifestyles. You know, are they working parents? Are they busy professionals? Are they traveling a lot? Taking account of their learning preferences because of their lifestyle, and trying to put together a number of different pathways that allow the student using this digitized curriculum to achieve the learning outcomes that you've set for your course. Now, that might sound like a can of worms, and sometimes it is, and yes, it is a bit of a bungee jump, and that there'll be a very strong temptation not to do it because it looks a bit too hard. But once you've done it once or twice and you've made mistakes, you can start to fix those mistakes up, and then it becomes a very rich and rewarding experience. So here's my last section. I've talked about pedagogy being more important than technology. I've talked about some of the psychological barriers that we need to overcome, particularly to help peers, colleagues that are less enthusiastic about making this change, about turning education on its head, flipping the classroom. And here is a checklist, and it's based on my own experience. 10 tips, and I don't like this alliterative approach where, I mean, I don't like books in airport lounges where it's, 7 secrets to success and so on and so forth. It literally was accidental. They ended up with 10. 10 tips on how to flip and not flop. Okay, so tip number 1, based on my experience, it's always a good idea. I might change that. Usually, most times it is a good idea, not always. Most times it's a good idea to start a class, a face-to-face class, or a synchronous online class by saying, any questions? All right, it might be a Q&A session, goes for 15, 20 minutes on the module that they've studied. So remember, they've got all the materials. You put them on Canvas, you put them on Microsoft Teams, in the online classroom, whatever classroom you're using. You've structured it, topic 1, topic 2, whatever. You say, right, anybody got any questions about topic 1, topic 2, topic 3? Okay, and they'll have read it. Now, first of all, they won't, because they won't be used to the type of pedagogy that you're using. But after a while, they'll soon cotton on that they're not going to get anywhere in this course unless they do their study before they come to class. Remember, we flipped it. So they study first, then come to class, rather than come to class, then study. All right. So start off with a Q&A on the module of work that they should have been studying. Number 2, don't make any cosmetic changes to give the appearance of flipping. All right? And I just realised I shouldn't use this. Maybe not use this graphic. It might be offensive to certain people. So if you're a vegetarian or a Muslim or you like pigs, I apologise for the use of this image. But you know, some people like to jump on the bandwagon and they say, yeah, I'll flip my classroom. But really all they've done is tinker around the edges, and when they get in the classroom, they still continue lecturing like they have done previously. You know, once you've got your materials, once you've created your materials, you've curated your materials, you've explained how to use those materials online at the learning management system, the delivery platform, then what should happen in any synchronous session, be it in the classroom or in the online synchronous classroom, is to clarify any misunderstanding. Tip number 3, develop authentic learning activities around unstructured problems that invite multiple equally correct responses. This is life. You know, life is never cut and dried. Admittedly, there'll be some subjects that we teach where there just may be one single answer, but there'll still be multiple ways that you can arrive at that answer. Okay, so try and create scenarios, preferably real scenarios with real companies, maybe with real people, but if not, at least develop scenarios that are believable from a student perspective. And if you have open-ended problems, then this lends itself to good asynchronous online discussions or indeed in-class activities. So often people make the mistake of setting a problem and putting it on a discussion forum, and it's all over very quickly because the answer is, 1030, and then there's no discussion. It's very important to think about problems that are messy problems, unstructured problems, because that invites the greatest amount of energy in terms of thought to try and address the problems. So here's an example of one I've used recently in a course I taught in Germany. I have students in groups. I say, right, identify 3 organizations, any organizations, that could be anywhere in the world, and look at their progress or otherwise in becoming a truly sustainable enterprise. Net zero impact, no greenhouse gas emissions, having a net ecological footprint. And I'm asking them to categorize those companies in terms of whether they're good, they're well advanced on their sustainability journey, they're bad in the sense that they're still unsustainable, or they're just plain ugly, that they're actually doing considerable harm to the natural environment because of their actions. And that, if you've got the resources for them to at least learn the basics about how we define a sustainable enterprise, they might watch a couple of short videos, people talking about sustainable enterprise, key characteristics, etc. Then you just let them go, all right? And of course, they'll look at the course materials, then they'll go online and find other materials, and then the deliverable is they come back at the end of the afternoon, give a 15-minute presentation talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly companies that they've found. And then there's a massive discussion between the students as to why or why not a company should be good or bad or ugly. Okay, so the investment of time up front is big. All right, but once you've done that, once you've got your library of learning artifacts, library of learning resources, then learning design becomes a whole lot easier. There's lots of opportunities to kind of drag and drop your resources that you've created and curated to put together in a course, irrespective of what that course is. Tip 4, trust me, some students will come to class and expect you to do all the work. They love the fact, some of them will love the fact that you sit there, talk for a couple of hours, and they put their feet up. I just had a bit of a late night. I'll just let my eyes have a little bit of a rest. And then, also expects of them to come unprepared, especially early on, because they won't be used to this method. And they'll say, well, I didn't know how to do this pre-reading. But once some students start doing it, then there's peer pressure on the others to follow suit. Tip number 5, and this is about us, you do have an easier time of it. I won't lie. Once you've prepared all of your digital resources and you've got them all neatly tucked away and you can bring them out and just tweak them as needs be, it's a lot easier to teach. I love teaching in this way. It gives me opportunity to give students individual feedback. I'll move from group to group and I'll have more time with individuals, those who are looking to do really well, those that are struggling, and making sure they, I make sure they get a pass mark. So it's our job to facilitate and prompt and probe. It isn't about having a bit of a bludge. That's an Australian word I've just realised. Verb, Australian verb, to bludge means take things easy, all right? Cut corners, dodge responsibility. Tip 6, ensure assessment activities are aligned with the pedagogy. It is not a good idea if you go down this path to have multiple choice tests at the end of the semester, if they're to be used for summative purposes, because that's inconsistent with the problem-based learning approach that you've taken. By all means, have multiple choice, but don't have them for summative purposes, have them for formative purposes. I use them all the time when I use Kahoot. It's a good way of reinforcing certain basic knowledge, but don't use them for end of semester assessments. Tip 7, you are the SME, the subject matter expert, but new content comes thick and fast. I encourage my learners to go and find content and to share what they find. So according to what discussion forum platform you use, there's a number out there. I like to use Yammer, which is a part of the Microsoft Office 365 suite. It functions a bit like Facebook, but without the adverts. There's other platforms coming up which you can integrate into your learning management system. But many times, I mean, this last week, I can think of several examples. I've just been using Padlet with my students here in Dubai, and my students have been uploading stuff to Padlet that I now know I will use next semester as part of my materials that I curate, because their videos that they found are better than the ones I've been using. Right? So they are becoming co-contributors to the curriculum, and they love that. If you say, hey, this is a great resource, Namita found this resource, go and take a look at what she shared on Padlet, because it's a great example of what we were talking about yesterday. The students brim with pride that the professor is using the resource that they found and not the resource that he was using. It's about engaging the learner. Tip number 8, I'm not sure whether or how many of you will have used this approach, but I don't use it all the time, but sometimes, depending on the topic, use the Socratic Method. So, answer a question by asking another question to lead a student down a certain path. It's a very powerful way of developing students' critical thinking, and it's a great way of prompting and probing, the expression I used earlier on, to get students to think for themselves rather than you simply providing them with the solution. 9, I think if you're responsible at an institutional level, you could even rethink your timetabling of classes. If you've got really good digital resources, then you may even be able to get by with fewer face-to-face classes. Maybe, just maybe, this might be one of the outcomes of COVID-19, is that people will think, well, do we need to have as many people coming to class as often? Do we have our professors working a few days at home, a few days on campus, maybe having some face-to-face classes, some online? do we need to be ready for the next time we have something like this happen? All right, so we need to invest in developing digital resources so that we don't have the same experience we had this time, where people were just thrown in the deep end and left to sink or swim. Can we, by doing this, by digitizing the curriculum, offer more flexibility of delivery? So you can say, have day students who come, once a week for 12 weeks or however long your semester is, or can we offer a course intensively, maybe online mostly, with a couple of face-to-face sessions over an intensive block? It gives you more options if you digitize your curriculum. And the final comment, and again, I repeat this for probably the 17th time this afternoon: don't be afraid of making mistakes. Making mistakes is good, okay? You either get it right or you learn. And flipping your classroom can take some time to perfect. But if you get it wrong, first of all, don't worry, just call it version 1.0. And so summarizing, the post-pandemic learning model, if it wasn't in existence to begin with, then this is how I think institutions should be proceeding. We want a participatory pedagogy that's learner-centric, allows the student to be both consumer and producer of information and knowledge. It must be authentic, driven by assessment and learning outcomes that are grounded in reality, making sure that what students learn is learning that lasts beyond the test in particular. And then lastly, it must be flexible, multimodal in format, allowing students to navigate different ways through the course, so long as they achieve those same learning outcomes as every other student in the classroom. And that, Shrikant and Shruti, is my last slide. And if people think that there's some time to go yet before they have to do anything about this, I would simply refer them to the quote, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you think they ever could.
Thanks, Jeremy. It was very interesting to hear the presentation and your experience, etc. Thank you very much for doing that. A couple of questions which have actually come up, and one of the questions that people are asking is that how do you teach critical thinking through online?
Well, there are a number of apps these days that you can utilize. I did think about trying one of these apps. Again, it's a kind of a Socratic method. You can put a statement online, and then the software allows you to either agree with it or disagree with it, and then someone could come along and they can upvote the view that you put forward, or downvote, as the case may be. And it's a way of stimulating and orchestrating discussion. But I looked at it, and I didn't want to introduce too many new apps to my students in any one go, so I've just gone with Padlet this semester, and students have been uploading to Padlet, and there's an opportunity there for them to discuss the various merits of particular viewpoints that might be put forward by the resource that they've uploaded, be it a video or a podcast or a journal article. But irrespective of the technology, it's simply a question, as I was saying just a few moments ago, of identifying a problem, an unstructured problem that allows the student to consider multiple perspectives. And if that problem has a number of equally correct solutions, then that's fine. All right, it just stimulates debate, and it's that stimulation of debate which allows the students to hone their critical thinking skills. Now, I do give them at the start of a course the basics in critical thinking. So I do have a model. I call it the stair-step critical thinking model. So I get them to first of all identify an unstructured problem. I then get them to identify contending perspectives on that unstructured problem. I then get them to look at the arguments for and against each one of those contending perspectives, and then to evaluate the strength of the arguments for and against. It's not just a quantitative analysis, it's a qualitative one. And then draw some conclusions based on the evidence of those arguments, but also identifying the weaknesses of their own conclusions. So they say, on the basis of the evidence presented above, this is what we would recommend based on these assumptions. If, however, those assumptions were to change, then our recommendations would be this. So there's techniques, there's ways of teaching critical thinking, and that's just the one I prefer. It's a good start. It's a good way of getting students to start thinking about critical thinking. But the key thing, the short answer to the question is find an unstructured problem. Okay, so I'll give you an example of one I used just this week. So I was teaching unemployment. It's an undergraduate class in macroeconomics, and we first looked at a structured problem. How do we count unemployment? How do we calculate the unemployment rate? So off they go. They look at the resources that they have, and they'll find out that it's the number of people who are actively looking for work who are unable to find it, so long as they are part of the labour force. So they must be actively looking for work to be in the labour force. Then whoever can't find a job in that labour force, we can calculate the percentage. And hey presto, the unemployment rate in UAE is 2.4%, or whatever the number is. That is a structured answer to a structured question. Okay. Yeah. Then I say in the Socratic method, is that good or bad? Right. And then you have an unstructured problem. Now, arguments that say yes, it's a bad problem, or arguments that, well, actually 2.4 is not bad if you compare it with other countries. And off they go. And then you have a critical debate on unemployment.
Great. Another question by Dr. J. Krishna Chaitanya, Associate Professor of Vardhaman College of Engineering, says, can you brief about the importance of self and peer assessment, and also which is to be used first when assessing groups?
Okay, this is a great question. And coincidentally, it's something I've been wrestling with this week as well. I'm teaching summer school, and a colleague and myself, we've decided to experiment with a simulation game. All right, so there's a simulation called Econland. It comes out of Harvard Business School Publishing. It's been written by another colleague, and therefore we got free access to it. But so we're experimenting with this simulation game. It's a great way of engaging the learner because they get to manage the economy. It's over seven years, and they get to make 7 decisions. And then according to what they do with 4 macro variables, unemployment, inflation, etc., GDP, government budgets, they get a score, right? And that score will give them an approval rating amongst the public. So it's a game. There's a gamification element, and we put the students into teams. And this is going to start week after next. and there'll be an element of competition. But we know that in each of those teams, there'll be people who will be working hard, there'll be people who are working less hard, and there'll be free riders. Okay, so you'll end up getting a grade if there's a really smart person in your group, and that's not fair. Okay, when I was at University of 21 in Singapore, this is more than 10 years ago now, we developed an online tool. It wasn't online when we got hold of it. There's a self and peer assessment tool that was developed by the University of Technology, Sydney. And it was all done using pen and paper, but we converted it into an online tool in Singapore a long time ago. Now I think it's actually become online anyway. And I've got another colleague here at Zayed who's using it. I haven't used it yet, but to answer the question that was asked, there is software which I think is pretty easy to use. You can make it so it's web-based in your learning management system. And before you award a team mark, you get each of the members of that team to go into this website, this self and peer assessment website, and they will grade themselves on a number of criteria in terms of how they contributed to the team effort, and then they'll vote for everybody else. And certainly when we did this at U21 in Singapore, and my colleague is finding this as well, because of peer pressure, it's very rare that if somebody hasn't worked hard, that they'll give themselves a high grade. They know whether they pulled their weight or not. And if they were to put a higher weight on their own effort, in respect of, in comparison to the mark given to them by their fellow team members, then it shows up. Ultimately, the professor is the one who gives the final mark, but ultimately, let's just say there's 3 people in the team, and you give the team a mark of 70, then one person might get 70, but one person who worked harder might get 75, and one person might get 65. So the total amount of marks for the group is equal. It's just a question of how you divide the marks. So everybody ends up with an individual mark for the team assignment. It's something that's not well done anywhere in the world. I'm very glad to hear Associate Professor asking this question, because it is something we need to address, because teamwork is a very important element of the world of work, and we don't like free riders, and we need to call them out, right? So it's an area where there needs to be a lot more work.
I remember the U21 model, and it seemed to be quite effective at that time.
Yes.
Moving to the next question, Jayashree is asking a question: is Loom simpler than OBS?
It is for me. It is simpler for me because the OBS is not very friendly to people who use Apple Mac.
Okay.
I have a friend at Zayed University who was waxing lyrical to me about this. He said, "Oh, I do all of my pre-recorded lectures using OBS, and you should use it." I thought, yes, okay, great. You know, I was using QuickTime and then uploading my QuickTime screencast up to YouTube. Then I'd get the code, copy and paste the code into Blackboard. Very laborious process. And he goes, "Oh, I just use OBS and send the students a link and everything's fine." And I was super jealous when I then discovered that I couldn't use it because I'm an Apple user. Or I could use it, but it wasn't quite as straightforward. And so the answer to the question, for me, Loom is definitely easier, yes. But have a look at it. I mean, it might be that OBS is easier for her.
Okay. So Dr. Madhumati is asking, please share some good website for every subject matter.
You mean in terms of open educational resources?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I can only give links to resources that I use for economics. It really is a question of, you know, maybe one weekend you just say, right, for the whole of this Saturday, I'm just going to sit at my computer. I'm going to start curating resources and just go and see what's out there. Certainly, if anybody's an economist and they want to find out where the best OER economics resources are, I can give them a few hints. But the most important thing is, rather than resources that are discipline specific, look for tools that will help you catalog and tag. So, I mean, I've got various tools and I use them in various ways. So I use Twitter. I've got two Twitter feeds. One is sort of general, and I've got another one that's just on sustainability. So if I read an article that I know is going to be useful for me for teaching at some stage, I tweet it as much for myself as for other people, because then I can think, now I read something about that topic a while ago, and I'll just go back through my tweets and I'll put the link to the article. There's another great tool I use routinely called Diigo. Diigo is spelled D-I-I-G-O, and it's a great way of annotating websites. So if you find a website you like, it's an article on a website, there may be a sentence or a paragraph that just encapsulates exactly what it is that you want to share with your students. And you can just highlight the paragraph, right-click if you install the Diigo extension in your browser, and it goes away to your Diigo library, and you can tag the articles that you collect. And I've been doing this for years now, and whenever I'm writing a paper or thinking about putting together some new courses, or even a PowerPoint presentation for a presentation like this, I can go to my Diigo account, do a search, and then I get a long list of all the articles that I've collected from the web and thought at the time, this is great, and then promptly forgot about, you know, until I use this tool to jog my memory.
Okay. What is the ideal online classroom teaching time ratio? That is being asked by Kachi Raju.
Kachi Raju is clearly been on this presentation too long, because this is too long, right? I mean, I'm now beginning to speak Braille because I've been talking too long. The ideal is, I think, and I mentioned it in one of my tips, 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the outside. Set the scene, check their understanding of the key concepts, make sure they've done what you've asked them to do, then give them a task, go away, come back in an hour, tell me what you've learned, you know. Well, that's how we teach in the 21st century.
Great. Okay. How can we estimate a student like average, intelligent, keep learners engaged, and to give more feedback?
Rubrics. Rubrics are critical, and again, I've done this. I just finished a rubric this morning. This colleague of mine, she and I are doing this macroeconomic simulation game, and it's the first time we've used this as an assessment item. So there's no existing assessment rubric. So we have to sit down, and we've tossed it around between the two of us now for several days. And we have the various grades, we have the various criteria, and then we write down statements that describe the performance of a student according to whether they're, exceeding expectations, they've met expectations, they're an average student, they're below expectations, or they've not even commenced to address the learning requirements. So assessment rubrics, again, all of these are online. We started this rubric by me going to a source where I know there's some good rubrics, finding one that's more or less what we like. Then I've edited it, and what will happen is I will reshare that assessment rubric back into the OER community. So if anybody does something similar, they can use our rubric.
Sure. Gary, there are a lot of questions, but before I move to the other questions, I'd like to ask you about, because during the U21 days, authentic assessment was one of the major things that we were working on when we wanted to see, especially for adult learners, how authentic learning can be actually evaluated or even evidenced. So probably if you could share some insights on authentic assessment, how assessments can be done for online learning, that'll be good.
Well, again, the bad news is that there is a lot of upfront work. It's much easier to take the multiple choice questions that come with the textbook, the test bank, and trot out the same old questions every semester, right? Now, of course, if you have an assessment instrument like that, it's very easy to cheat. Okay, so right now at Zayed University, because we went into it very quickly, it was literally, as from next week, we're teaching online, and all end of semester exams will be conducted in a lockdown browser. And even, given the culture in UAE, and I'm teaching at a university that's all female, right? Their university is a women's university. And the UAE government, the Ministry of Education, was so concerned to make sure that no one was cheating. They even allowed, or not allowed, they mandated that students would do exams in lockdown browser and they would be on camera. And I was very surprised by this. But for me, this is policy being made on the run. I think moving forward, we have to think more deeply about assessment design that does away with lockdown browsers and cameras and so on, which is, I think, a little heavy-handed, to say the least. I appreciate that you have to do it in an emergency, but you can design assessments in such a way that it is very difficult for someone to cheat. Okay? Does that mean that no one will ever cheat? No, of course not. It just means that the opportunities for cheating are less. Even in a proctored face-to-face examination, an examination hall in the university, anywhere in India, people will cheat. They'll have things written on their arm, they'll have things written on their pencil case. People get caught cheating every semester in every university in every country in the world. Fact. Okay? So if you have that as your starting point, then you say to yourself, right, if we went for an assessment instrument that had opportunities for cheating that was certainly no more than the opportunities that invigilated exams have, are we okay with that? And if the answer is yes, especially if they get a better learning outcome, better learning experience, then that's what you'll go for. So the trick is to create a scenario, preferably a real one. If not, then make up a scenario that has the appearance of being real, it's authentic, it's believable, and you put the learner in the position of decision maker, manager, auditor, here's the situation. You just finished a course on macroeconomics. Someone is asking you as a consultant, how would you fix this problem of a falling away of demand because of coronavirus for your particular business? What are the possible solutions to this which might stimulate demand and assist you to get through this period? And then I think this is real. This is happening in my country right now. This is happening where I live. It's happening to people I know. So you engage with it, okay? And if you engage the learner, then they're far less likely to say, go on Google and say, you know, how can I get an answer to this assignment? Which a lot of people do, and they pay a lot of money, sadly, and they're paying a lot of money to criminals who, once they get your details, your ID, your email address, and the fact that you've paid on your credit card for that assignment, when you move through the ranks and become a successful government administrator or something like that, and this person from, I don't know, from Russia or wherever this criminal gang is, and they'll say, oh, actually, we've got some information on you that back in 2018, you were buying assignments to get yourself, to buy yourself a degree in economics, right? So I tell all this to students as well. It is not in your best interest to deal with criminal gangs, right? To buy your way to a university degree. So that plants the seed of doubt, together with, if you engage the learner and minimize the opportunity for cheating because it's about their personal reflections on what they've done in the course, then you get deep learning instead of surface learning. And they leave not only passing an economics exam, but they actually know something about economics.
Okay. Yeah, I still remember, during U21 days, we used to have these 24 hours, 1,000 words problem to be solved. And as you rightly said, create a scenario which is quite, equal to the real one. And then as a decision maker or a manager or a auditor, get the people to solve it. I think at that time that was really quite effective.
Well, it's because if you pick something that happened in the news last week, they can't go and copy paste from a website,
True.
right?
Right.
I mean, it's easier for other subjects than some subjects and others. I accept that.
Right. So, Ms. Sarita Sidma Shetty is asking, on what basis online performance is measured? Learners' performance measurement.
Yeah. Again, this is a good question. It's about design, learning design, and I'll give you another example, a very current example. So right now, I'm giving a short lecture in addition to course content I've put online for them in macroeconomics. So I've got 9 modules. All of the content is online for each of those 9 modules. Each week, I give a short lecture. They then do some work as individuals and as in groups using various tools, Padlet I've mentioned already. But what I say to them is, come to class, we'll do a Kahoot quiz on the last session in the week. We do it in class. It's a bit of fun, bit of competition. The marks don't count for anything in the Kahoot quiz, but I insist that I got a mark. I don't call it a mark for participation. I call them end of module activities. And part of the opportunity they have, they don't have to, it's up to them, but I say you must complete all of the Kahoot quiz questions. If you don't get them all right in the class, you do a personal challenge online. You keep doing those questions until you get them all right. And then if you do, then you get maximum marks. So I try and encourage participation in that way. But also, if you use discussion tools, online discussion tools, some of the more sophisticated ones that allow you to, like and upvote people's contributions, then students, I mean, all of us really, we like to be appreciated for the views we've shared, and you know, it's an incentive to participate. If a student's not participating, then as far as I'm concerned, they cannot be learning. I mean, there will be rare occurrences where you get some brilliant genius who also happens to be a massive introvert and just likes to work by themselves and not interact with anybody. They are the exception rather than the rule. But the short answer to the question is about learning design and having certain mechanisms in place that keep students doing small amounts of work on a regular basis. Little and often is my catchphrase.
Little and often, great. Thanks, Jeremy. Really appreciate you're taking out time. Over to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much. It was a very different. It gave us a different perspective of how the entire thing can be handled, because now that we have to switch to the online learning model, there has been a lot of speculation, probably because we have not experimented with this model as much as we probably should have. So, like they say, necessity is the mother of invention. So now that we have been pushed into a situation where we have to experiment with things, there are a lot of people who are showing more interest, which is an absolutely good thing, and a lot of good insights. In fact, I was going through the comments of the participants, and a lot of people have said very good insights, and it's given them clarity on actually how to plan their classes. Now that they have to switch online, and some of the questions that we got were also good. That means people actually trying to process and trying to implement and understand how the implementation can actually happen and how it can be best for the students as well. Thank you very much. I thank all the participants for sitting through the session and for participating actively. It's been great. A very good experience. In fact, Jeremy, I should tell you, some of the most common comments we got were with regard to how easily understandable the slides were.
Because there are pictures.
Yes, because of the pictures. And I think that is something that a lot of participants will take back. So the content can actually be spoken verbally, but the same thing doesn't have to be replicated in the slides. The picture speaks louder than 1,000 words, like they say, one picture. So that is something, one good feedback that most of the participants have given, and I think they will try to use that in their classes as well. Thank you, Shrikant sir, for having Jeremy with us. It's been fantastic, and we'll definitely look forward to more sessions.
Okay, have a good day, everybody. Bye for now.
Good day to you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.